The snow came early that year in the Laurentian Highlands, the kind of snow that doesn't announce itself politely, but simply arrives overnight and buries everything you thought was certain. Wren Calloway was 23 years old, alone in a way that the word alone cannot fully hold, and she was watching her two daughters sleep on a folded horse blanket in the back of a canvas-covered freight wagon that no longer belonged to her. The wagon belonged to no one now. The horse that had pulled it had gone lame 3 days east of Lac Saint Jean, and Wren had led the old mare to a farm outside Saint Félicien and traded her for 2 jars of salted pork, a sack of dried oats, and a promise from the farmer's wife that the animal would be treated kindly. She had walked the wagon tongue herself the last 2 miles to this clearing in the trees, using sheer stubbornness in place of horsepower, her 6-year-old daughter Blythe walking beside her and her 4-year-old June, riding in the wagon bed wrapped in everything Wren owned that could be wrapped around a small body. That had been 4 days ago. Now the oats were gone, 1 jar of pork remained, and the November cold had stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous. Blythe had her father's dark eyes and his habit of watching things very carefully before speaking. She woke before June that morning and crawled to the gap in the canvas and looked out at the white world without saying anything for a long time. "Mama," she finally said, "the fire went out." "I know, sweetheart. Are we going somewhere today?" Wren looked at the last of the dry wood stacked against the wagon wheel, barely enough for one more small fire, and said, "Yes, we are." She didn't say where, because she didn't know. What she knew was that they were somewhere east of the Parabanca River, that the nearest town was likely a day's walk in conditions she couldn't guarantee, and that her younger daughter had started making a sound in her chest when she breathed, a soft, wet clicking that hadn't been there a week ago, and was now constant enough that Wren heard it even in her sleep. Her husband, Daniel Calloway, had been a surveyor for the Dominion Lands Office in Quebec City. A good man in the way that certain men are good without effort, naturally, quietly, as though goodness were simply the direction they moved in. He had brought his family north 2 years earlier, following a contract to survey the upper Lac Saint Jean basin, promising Wren that it was temporary, that they would return to Montreal by spring. He had been 3 weeks from completing the survey when he fell through river ice in March. The water there moved faster than it appeared from the bank. They recovered his body downstream 2 days later. What followed happened with the speed and bureaucratic indifference that grief never prepares you for. The lands office terminated the contract. The small timber house they had been renting from a man named Aldrich Thorne, she crossed through this name in her mind, not wanting to speak it even silently, was reclaimed. Thorne produced a document signed by someone in Quebec City whose signature Wren did not recognize, claiming that Daniel had drawn an advance on 3 months' wages that had never been repaid. The amount was larger than anything Daniel had ever mentioned. When Wren asked to see the original payroll ledger, Thorne's solicitor explained patiently that the ledger was held in Quebec City and could not be produced in a reasonable time frame. She had 24 hours to vacate. She took what she could carry, loaded her daughters into the wagon, and drove north, because it was the direction away from Thorne's office, and north was the only direction that felt like it still belonged to her. She had been heading toward a cousin in Chicoutimi, someone she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, but who she believed still lived there, who might take them in for the winter while she sorted out what came next. The horse had gone lame before she got there, and so here they were, Blythe watching the dead fire with her father's careful eyes, and June making that sound in her chest, and Wren counting the remaining pork and the remaining wood, and arriving at the same sum every time she counted. Not enough. She was stoking the last of the fire with a branch, trying to boil water for the oats she no longer had, when she heard it, a sound from the tree line. Slow, deliberate footsteps in deep snow, the kind made by something large and unhurried. Wren set Blythe behind her, without speaking, and picked up the short-handled axe that had been her husband's, the one thing of his she had kept beyond the papers and the photographs, because an axe was practical. The trees were a dark wall of spruce and balsam fir, and for a long moment there was only the wind moving through the upper branches. Then a figure stepped out of them. He was not what she expected, which she realized immediately was a foolish thing to think, since she had no idea what she had expected. He was tall, considerably taller than Daniel had been, wearing a heavy wool Mackinaw coat, so faded it had gone from whatever color it started, as to a kind of tired gray-green, the collar turned up against the cold. His face was bearded, the beard dark, going to frost at the jaw, and he wore a canvas hat with the brim pulled low. He was carrying a brace of snowshoe hair in one hand and a wood axe, a real one, a full-sized felling axe, in the other. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at Wren with her small axe and her expression, and then looked past her, at the wagon, and the small figures visible in the gap in the canvas, and his expression did not change the way a threatening man's expression changes. It settled, the way a man settles when he is recalibrating his intentions to suit an unexpected situation. "I saw your fire last night," he said. His voice was low and carried a roughness to it, not meanness but disuse, the voice of someone who spoke infrequently and so did not bother smoothing the edges. "Thought it was a trapper's camp." "It's not," Wren said. "No," he agreed. He was looking at the wagon again, at June's small face now appearing in the canvas gap beside her sister's. "How long have you been out here?" "Long enough." He looked at the axe in her hand, and then at her face. There was something in the way he looked that was different from the way Thorne's solicitor had looked, different from the way the farm families she had passed on the road had looked, men who saw a young widow with 2 children and either saw a problem they didn't want or an opportunity they did. This man looked at her the way her father had looked at things, assessing without judging, the way a person looks at weather. "There's a sickness in the younger one," he said. It wasn't a question. Wren's jaw tightened. "She's fine." He didn't argue. He simply set the hair down on a clean patch of snow, leaned his axe against the nearest tree, and said, "My name is Griffith Holt. I have a trapping cabin 1.5 miles northeast of here, up the ridge. It's warm and it's dry, and it has a proper stove." He paused. "I'm not asking anything from you. I'm telling you what exists, and I'm saying you should use it." Wren looked at him. She had spent 2 months learning to be suspicious of everything, and the habit was deep now and she trusted it. But she was also a woman who had led a lame horse through mud and then pulled a freight wagon with her own arms, and she knew the difference between the feeling of danger and the feeling of her own fear, even when they dressed similarly. "Why?" she said. Griffith Holt looked at her steadily. "Because your fire is nearly out and that child is coughing." He had heard it from the trees. Even from that distance, through the wind, he had heard June's breathing. "My daughters come with me," Wren said. "I assumed," he said, "she kept the axe." The walk was brutal in the way that physical hardship in extreme cold is always brutal, methodically, without drama, simply presenting the body with more difficulty than comfort can process. Griffith went ahead, breaking trail through snow that reached Wren's thighs in the drifted places, and she carried June against her chest, under her coat, and Blythe held onto the back of Wren's belt and didn't complain once. The cabin emerged from the trees with no warning. One moment there was only forest, and then there was a structure, low-roofed and heavy-logged, built so close against the rock face of the ridge that it seemed less constructed than grown there. Snow had piled against the north wall until it nearly reached the eaves. A steel stovepipe emerged from the roof, and the faint smell of old wood smoke hung around it like a memory. Griffith pushed the door open and stood aside. The warmth hit Wren like something physical. The interior was a single room, larger than it had appeared from outside, with a cast-iron box stove against the far wall, radiating a heat so dry and complete that Wren felt her eyes water. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a sleeping pallet raised off the floor on wooden legs, and along the walls, shelves that held the organized matériel of a man who lived practically. Canned goods, dried herbs in paper wrappings, tools, rope, a row of glass jars holding things she didn't yet know the contents of. Griffith crossed immediately to the stove and opened the damper wider, then lifted a cast-iron pot from a hook on the wall and began filling it from a water barrel in the corner. "Sit," he said, not harshly. In the way a man says it when he means, "Stop standing up just to prove you can." Wren sat on the nearer chair and pulled June into her lap. Blythe stood very still inside the doorway, looking at everything with the precise attention of a child who has learned that strange places require assessment before ease. "There are blankets on the shelf," Griffith said. "The top ones are wool. Get the little one wrapped up." Wren stood, took the blanket, and settled back with June, who had stopped making the clicking sound in the warmth, or rather, Wren realized, had not stopped. But the sound was softer now, perhaps only because the ambient noise was softer. Griffith noticed her noticing. "Yarrow and mullein," he said, nodding toward the paper-wrapped herbs on the shelf. "For the chest. I'll make a steam with it. It should ease the congestion by morning." He glanced at June, with an expression so briefly careful that Wren almost missed it. "How long has she had it?" 10 days, maybe 11. He nodded, unsurprised and unalarmed, which Wren found steadying in a way she hadn't expected. He simply began to work quietly and with great efficiency the way people move in their own kitchens, with the ease of long repetition. "What's her name?" he asked. "June. And this is Blythe." He looked at Blythe. "There's a tin of Pilot biscuits on the second shelf," he said. "You can have them." Blythe looked at Wren. Wren nodded. Blythe retrieved the tin, opened it with great seriousness, took one biscuit, and brought the tin to her mother before taking a second for herself. Griffith watched this. Something moved briefly across his face and then was gone. He cooked the hare in a broth with dried onion and juniper berries and a handful of something dark she didn't ask about, and the smell of it filled the cabin until even June, who had eaten almost nothing for 2 days, stirred in Wren's arms and said, "What's that?" "Supper," Griffith said, and it was the first time Wren heard what might have been something close to warmth in his voice. They ate. It was the best thing Wren had tasted in 2 months, which she understood was partly deprivation, and partly the fact that it was genuinely very good. Griffith ate his own portion quickly and without conversation, and then set his bowl aside and began preparing the yarrow steam for June. Holding the bowl at the right angle and angling a cloth over the child's head with a practicality that suggested he had done something like this before. "You have children," Wren said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out as a statement. The silence that followed was specific, not offended, not evasive. The silence of someone pressing a thumb to an old injury to locate it. "Had," Griffith said. Wren didn't press. The word had a particular weight and she recognized it. Later, with both girls asleep on the pallet under 2 wool blankets, Wren sat at the table with a cup of spruce tea that Griffith had made without asking if she wanted it, and she thought about the weight of that single word and what it carried. "My husband was a surveyor," she said. It felt important to begin somewhere. Griffith sat across from her, his large hands wrapped around his own cup. He looked at her and waited. She told him about Daniel, about the ice, about the documents Thorne had produced, about the advance she did not believe existed, about the 24 hours. She told it plainly, the way she had learned to tell difficult things without ornamentation, because ornamentation cost energy she no longer had. When she finished, Griffith was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich Thorne," he said, and she heard something shift in his voice. Not anger, exactly, but a recognition that precedes it. "From Saint Félicien." Wren looked up. "You know him! I know of him!" Griffith set his cup down and looked at his hands. They were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that accumulate over years of outdoor work. "He's been acquiring land along the basin for 5 years. Northern Quebec Land and Timber Company, nominally, but Thorne controls the decisions. He's taken 3 properties near the river in the last 2 seasons, all of them from people who couldn't easily contest him. Daniel's survey," Wren said slowly. The quartz surveys. He was documenting mineral potential along the upper basin. He told me he'd found something significant near the Peribonka headwaters. He hadn't filed the formal assessment yet. Griffith looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. If Thorne knew what that survey contained before the file was completed and registered, he'd want it gone. Wren finished. Her voice came out flat. Before Daniel could submit it, before anyone could act on it. The words sat between them on the table like a thing with mass. Daniel's death, Wren said carefully, was described as an accident, river ice, unlucky. She heard herself saying the words and heard how hollow they sounded now against everything she was assembling. He wasn't careless. He had worked on that river for 2 winters. He knew ice. Men who know ice still fall through, Griffith said. He was not dismissing her. He was being honest. Yes, said Wren, they do. She paused. But a man who knows a river doesn't cross it alone at noon in March. On a section he has told his wife repeatedly is unreliable. Griffith was looking at her steadily now. He had the kind of stillness that is not inattention but its opposite. There was nothing in the official survey notes when they returned his belongings to me, Wren said. The surveying notebook he always carried. It was empty. The first 30 pages torn out. Griffith stood and crossed to a wooden box against the wall. He unlocked it with a small brass key he kept on a cord inside his shirt and lifted out a canvas survey satchel, aged and water-stained. He set it on the table in front of Wren. She recognized it before she could process how. The initials pressed into the canvas near the buckle. D.C. Daniel Calloway. I found that, Griffith said quietly, on the riverbank, caught in a logjam 3 miles downstream from where they said he drowned, 2 days after it happened. I was running a trap line. I didn't know whose it was then. He paused. I know now. Wren opened the satchel with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside, beneath a folded piece of oilcloth, was a smaller notebook, spiral-bound, the kind Daniel used for field notes. She turned to the first page. The handwriting was Daniel's. She knew it the way she knew his voice. The entry was dated 3 days before his death. Thorne's man followed me to the North Camp again. I didn't show him the upper basin readings. The quartz vein near the headwaters runs deeper than I first measured. This is a significant find, and the proper registration at the Federal Land Office needs to happen before Thorne can get his survey team in. I'm sending a copy of the readings to the Federal Registry in Ottawa by post tomorrow. If something's before I can file in person, the original readings are inside the compass case. Clara will know which compass. Wren stopped. Her name was wrong, but everything else was right. Daniel hadn't written Clara. He had written Wren. She was misreading through her tears. She read it again. Wren will know which compass. Griffith watched her set the notebook down. He didn't say anything. There was a gentleness in his silence that she hadn't expected from a man who looked like winter itself. The compass, Wren said. I have it. I kept everything of his that was small enough to carry. I have his field compass. She looked up at Griffith. His gray eyes were steady. We need to get you to the Federal Land Office, he said, not the provincial registry. Federal. Quebec City is too close to Thorne's reach. Ottawa is the better option, but that takes time. In the meantime, a sound reached them through the heavy log walls. It was unmistakable once heard. The snuff and blow of horses moving through snow, and beneath it, the low murmur of men talking to each other the way men talk when they believe they are not being heard. Griffith was on his feet before Wren had fully processed what she was hearing. He crossed to the narrow aperture in the log wall beside the door, the kind of gap left deliberately in frontier construction, and looked through it without showing his face. He turned back to her. His expression had gone very still. 3 riders, he said. Coming up the west trail. They're not trappers. He paused. They're wearing town cots, Thorne's men. Wren was already moving toward the sleeping girls. Go through the back, Griffith said, pointing to the far wall, where a second door, smaller, was set into the logs. 50 feet into the trees there's a root cache cut into the ridge. Metal door, ring pull, covered in spruce boughs. Get inside with the girls and do not open it until you hear my voice. And if I don't hear your voice. Griffith took his rifle down from the wall rack, a heavy lever action that she later learned was a Winchester model from the previous decade, maintained to a condition that contradicted its age. He checked the action with the practiced brevity of a man who has done it 10,000 times. You will, he said. She wanted to say more. There were things pressing behind her sternum that she didn't have the words for, or perhaps simply didn't have the time. She took June in her arms and Blythe's hand in her free hand, and she went through the back door into the cold dark. The cache was where he had said it would be, invisible under the snow-laden branches until she was nearly on top of it. She got the door open, bundled her daughters inside into absolute blackness, and pulled it shut over them. Blythe pressed against her side without making a sound. June breathed her ragged, clicking breath. The cold inside the cache was sharp and total. Outside, Wren could hear the riders reach the cabin. A voice carried over the wind, big with false authority. Holt! Griffith Holt! We're looking for a woman and 2 children. Word is you found them on the ridge. Step out and talk to us. There was a pause. Then Griffith's voice, from somewhere that sounded like it came from above the cabin rather than inside it. I'm not in the habit of talking to men who ride up on another man's property without calling ahead. Another voice, this one harder and less patient. Don't get clever with us, old man. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. The woman stole documents belonging to Mr. Thorne's company. She's got property that doesn't belong to her, and we're authorized to retrieve it. Authorized by who? By a provincial warrant. A long silence, then, show it to me. A shorter silence. No paper materialized, apparently. That's what I thought, Griffith said. What followed was not the cinematic exchange of shouts that Wren had half expected. There was a brief and ugly scramble of sound, one voice rising to something that ended abruptly, a hoarse screaming, a second voice saying something that broke off in the middle, and then a longer silence interrupted only by the wind in the spruce and the sound of hooves retreating down the ridge at a speed that indicated panic. Then, very close to the cache door, Mrs. Calloway. Griffith's voice. She pushed the door open. He was standing in the snow above her, his breath visible in the cold air, his coat collar white with it. He had a small cut along his jawline that was just beginning to show, and he was holding 3 horses' reins in one hand, the horses themselves looking extremely dissatisfied with recent events. Are you hurt? Wren said. No. He looked at the horses. They left these behind. We'll need them. She looked at him in the dark and felt something rearrange itself in her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet and didn't try to name. The following morning they packed what was portable from the cabin. Griffith moved with the efficient grief of a man preparing to leave a place he had built with his hands and intended to return to, but who understood that the return was not guaranteed. He showed Wren the route on a hand-drawn map, a day's ride south to Roberval, where there was a telegraph office and a federal land agent he knew by name. You said you had a wife, Wren said, as she was saddling the smaller of the 3 horses. Earlier, you said had. Griffith worked the cinch on the second horse without looking up. 7 years ago. There was a man who wanted the cabin and the trapline. I wouldn't sell. He didn't argue about it. A pause. He hired someone instead. Wren didn't ask more, and he didn't offer it, but she understood now the quality of his silence, why it felt familiar. It was the silence of someone who had stood inside a grief large enough to change the shape of them and had learned to carry the new shape without complaint. Thorne, she said. No. A different man. Thorne's operation wasn't here then. He pulled the cinch tight. But it's the same logic. Take what you want. Make the papers say what you need them to say. By the people who are supposed to stop you. He finally looked at her. The morning light was coming through the trees in long, nearly horizontal bars, and it caught the gray of his eyes in a way that made him look, briefly, like someone who had not always lived inside a life this solitary. The compass, he said. Do you have it? She reached into her coat and produced it. A standard surveyor's field compass in a brass case, the kind sold by every instrument shop in Montreal. Griffith turned it over in his hands. He opened the case and examined the interior. His large thumb ran along the inner rim of the lid, and there it was, a thin disk of rolled paper, held by the compass's own spring, invisible until you knew to look. He unrolled it with great care on the saddle blanket. The readings were there in Daniel's handwriting, grid references and assay notations that Wren couldn't fully interpret but that she understood were significant, because Daniel had died rather than let them fall into the wrong hands. At the bottom, in smaller writing, this goes to the Federal Registry in Ottawa. Not Quebec City. Ottawa. For Wren. Wren pressed her fingers against the words, not because she needed to feel them to believe they were real, but because they were the last thing Daniel had written, and she wanted, just for a moment, to be in contact with them. Griffith watched her. He didn't look away or pretend not to notice. He simply let her have the moment without filling it. "He trusted you to figure it out," Griffith said quietly. "He trusted me to keep going," Wren said. Which was the same thing, she supposed. They rode out as the sun cleared the ridgeline. Blythe rode in front of Griffith, sitting very upright with her father's seriousness, watching the forest with complete attention. June rode with Wren, her chest still clicking but less, the yarrow having done something measurable in the night. By the time the Parabonka Valley opened up below them, and Wren could see the frozen shimmer of the lake to the south, June had fallen asleep against her shoulder, breathing with something closer to ease. In Roberval, the federal land agent, a compact, meticulous man named Mr. Fontaine, who wore his skepticism visibly but was clearly moved by the combination of Daniel's survey notes, the field compass with its hidden readings, and Wren herself, who presented both with a composure that came not from calm but from exhaustion too deep for theatrics, registered the survey claim under the estate of Daniel Calloway, with Wren named as administrator. He sent a telegraph to the office of the Surveyor General in Ottawa that same afternoon. He also, on his own initiative, sent a second telegraph to the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Detachment in Chicoutimi regarding one Aldrich Thorne and the matter of forged debt instruments and possible criminal interference with a federal land survey. What followed took time, because justice in the North in those years was not swift, but it was thorough when it came. Thorne's provincial connections proved less durable than he had believed once federal attention was applied. A mounted police investigation the following spring turned up the name of the man Thorne had paid to doctor the ice on the Parabonka River that March morning, a detail that was both the hardest thing Wren would ever hear confirmed and also, in a way she could not fully explain, a kind of mercy, because it meant Daniel had not been simply unlucky, which was a thought she had found, in its way, harder to bear than the truth. The Calloway mineral claim was one of the most significant registered in the Lac St. John basin in a generation. Wren did not become wealthy in the way that word is commonly used, but she became secure, which was more important to her and which Daniel, she believed, would have preferred. She bought a house in Roberval, small, practical, with a garden that faced south and a wood stove that burned with a completeness she had spent 2 months in the cold learning to appreciate. She enrolled Blythe in the local school that January, and the girl arrived on her first day with her father's careful eyes and her mother's stubborn set of the jaw, and made exactly one friend before lunch. June's chest cleared by February. She grew into a loud, cheerful child who was afraid of almost nothing, and who climbed every structure within reach with an enthusiasm that kept Wren in a state of low-grade vigilance for years. Griffith Holt came south out of the Laurentians in April, when the snow was finally pulling back from the lower elevations and the mud was spectacular. He appeared at the door of Wren's house on a Wednesday morning in a clean coat that looked like he had purchased it recently, holding his hat in both hands with the uncertainty of a very large man in a small doorway. "I came to see how you were," he said. "I know," said Wren. He came in. He stayed for supper. He stayed for the better part of 5 years after that, though the formal arrangement of staying took a bit longer to arrive at, because Wren was cautious and Griffith was patient, and neither of them was interested in a thing that wasn't built correctly. On a September afternoon, standing on the south-facing porch, with the lake visible in the distance, and the sound of Blythe and June arguing companionably in the garden below, Griffith set down his coffee cup and looked out at the water. "I think it's peaceful here," he said. Wren leaned against the doorframe and looked at him, at the winter-colored beard going to silver now, at the hands that had broken trail through chest-deep snow so that her daughters could walk behind him, at the man who had heard June's breathing from 100 feet away in the dark and had made a decision. "It is," she said. She reached over and covered his hand with hers, the way a person settles a thing that has been uncertain and is now at last decided. Outside, June was laughing at something her sister had said, the sound of it carrying up to the porch and across the open water, clean and clear in the autumn air, the sound of a child who had learned that the world, despite its considerable evidence to the contrary, was sometimes also this.